Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to invite you very kindly to this webinar that we're co-organizing with the Faculty of Law, and I would like to say hello to my colleague and good friend, Professor Marco Wan, who is joining us from Manchester today. This is a webinar that we're co-organizing together. And it's also in partnership with the Hong Kong Holocaust and Tolerance Center, and it's on a really fascinating topic. We're going to be talking about the life of somebody who is truly inspirational for the evolution of the international justice system, Ben Ferencz. Ben Ferencz was born in 1920 in Romania. And he sort of rose to prominence after the end of World War II in occupied Germany, when he was part of the legal team leading the first trials, and in particular the Einsatzgruppen trial, which tried some of the 24 most heinous perpetrators of the Holocaust in 1947, 1948. So he's really he was really at the birth of that international legal system that exists until today. And by the way, for those of you who might not know, that Ben Ferencz is actually still alive. So he later then also became a major advocate for the creation of the International Criminal Court. And to make sense, and just really to explore and make sense of all of this fascinating life and the story of Ben Ferencz, we are joined by our guest speaker, Professor Gregory Gordon. And Professor Gregory Gordon is a wonderful expert on this matter, because he is actually Ben Ferencz's biographer. So he is in the midst of writing a biography on Ben Ferencz. And also, let me just give you a little bit of an introduction to Gregory, because he brings together a lot of very interesting dimensions that can explain to us not only the life and the work of Ben Ferencz, but also the implications of what this has for the international legal system. So Gregory Gordon is the professor of law at Chinese University at Hong Kong. Prior to joining CUHK, he was a tenured faculty member at the University of North Dakota. And he was the director of the University of North Dakota Center for Human Rights and Genocide Studies. He earned his Bachelor of Arts degree and Juris Doctor of the University of California at Berkeley. And he then served as a law clerk to the US District Court Judge Martin Pence. And after a stint as a litigator in San Francisco, he worked with the Office of the Prosecutor for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where he served as legal officer and the deputy team leader for the landmark media cases trial, the first international post-Nuremberg prosecutions of radio and print media executives for the incitement of genocide. For this work, Professor Gordon received a commendation from the Attorney General Janet Reno for services to the United States and international justice. And after his experience at the ICTR, he became a white-collar criminal prosecutor with the US Department of Justice in the Tax Division. Following a detail as a special assistant US attorney for the District of Columbia, he was appointed as the Tax Division's liaison to organized crime and drug enforcement task forces in the Pacific region, for which he had helped prosecute large narcotic trafficking rings. And also during his time, he was detailed to Sierra Leone to conduct post-Civil War justice assessments for the Department of Justice's Office of Overseas Prosecutorial Development. And he joined the DOJ's Criminal Division Office of Special Investigations, where he helped investigate and prosecute Nazi war criminals and modern human rights violators. So here we have this really fantastic combination on the one hand, the insight into the life of Ben Ferencz, and also the Gregory's amazing experience in prosecuting crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide crimes. So what we have planned is for Gregory to give us an overview of Ben Ferencz's life. Who was he? What did he do? In the first half an hour. And then we can sort of, after that, open to your questions and comments. And may I invite you to do the following, to either use, you can see on the bottom of your screen, you can see two functions. There's the raise hand function, and then you can turn on your microphones and cameras to ask a question directly, or you can use the Q&A button to put questions there. in the and then which we can then take and read out. So without any further ado, I would like to invite Gregory. And Gregory, you still need to turn on your camera, and then
I tried. It says it won't let me. The host has stopped it.
Let's see. We've not stopped any. Let's see where.
Yeah, if you can allow me to show my camera or turn it on, I will.
This is the problem of Zoom. I can't see.
And I'll also I'll need to be able to share my screen as well, because I do have a PowerPoint.
But you are set as. I don't know how to. Let me just see. We need to. Just need our IT team quickly to see whether we can fix this here, but chat pin. Excuse me for 1 second.
No problem. Thanks for your patience, everybody.
There we go. We can see your screen now.
Yeah, well, I did that.
Put it in play mode, then we can. Wanted to commence from here.
Yeah, I don't think I can. It's not going to let me show myself. So unfortunately,
yeah,
the best I can do.
We will try to fix that.
Okay. All right. Well,
thanks.
Thank you everybody for your patience. And can everybody still see my PowerPoint? Great. So my talk today is Nuremberg Prosecutor Benjamin Ferencz and the Evolution of International Justice from the Holocaust to the Invasion of Ukraine. I want to thank Professors Vogt and Juan for inviting me. And Professor Vogt, thank you for the kind introduction. It's really an honor to be here. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're trying our best to work our way through that. And at least you've got my PowerPoint, which is good. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on, as you know, I'm writing the biography of Benjamin Ferencz. My biography is tentatively titled Nuremberg's Citizen Prosecutor, Benjamin Ferencz and the Birth of International Justice. And what I would like to do is kind of give you the overview of my book, the way I have it divided. So I kind of enjoy I'm a big fan of alliteration. And so it's worked out that I've been able to divide the book up into a number of P words that fit Ben Ferencz's life. So I'll begin with the prelude, preparing, probing, prosecuting, providing, and preventing. And then I'll conclude with some reflections on what's happening in Ukraine right now and the importance of Ben Ferencz. The main thrust of my PowerPoint presentation will be his time during World War II and as a prosecutor for the Einsatzgruppen. Okay, apparently I can now turn on my camera. No, it says that the host is stopping me from doing that. When I try to do it, it says you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. So that's unfortunate. My guess is that's probably because I'm still just a guest along with the rest of you. They have not made me a host for some reason. So my apologies for that. But anyway, you see the structure of my presentation. Let me begin with the prelude part. So the first three chapters of the book are, I call chapter 1, From Dracula's Castle to Hell's Kitchen. You heard Professor Vogt talk about the fact that Ben Ferencz was born in Romania. He was born in a small town called Silt on March 11th, 1920. Interestingly, the year that the League of Nations Covenant went into effect. So he was born into this sort of new world order that didn't quite last, and that would result in the conflagration that we know as World War II. But when he was born, it was a time right after World War I, obviously, as we talk about the League of Nations, when the area in Transylvania where he was living was transferred from the Hungarians or the Austro-Hungarian Empire to the Romanians, and there was fear of anti-Semitic persecution, and so they decided to leave. Interestingly, the great Holocaust author Elie Wiesel, who would go on to become a Nobel Peace Prize winner, he was born not far from where Ben Ferencz was born. His family didn't move out, and of course he went through the hell of the Holocaust, was able to survive. But Ben and his family left at the beginning of 1921, and they arrived in New York City, and that's what the reference to Hell's Kitchen is. He spent the first part of his life in the Hell's Kitchen neighborhood, and he had a very difficult childhood. His parents did not get along well. They were constantly fighting. He was very small. He's always been a very small person. He's now, even at the peak of his physical growth, he was probably only about 5 foot, 5'1" max. So he was a tiny kid. He was in a household that was going through a lot of problems, and he just had a tough life. Oh, there's my camera. Now it's working. Can you all see me? Hi.
Hallelujah,
right.
It's working.
It's working. I figured I'd just give it a shot. And Great. By the way, now you can see that I was actually wearing a coat and tie this entire time. So I didn't just put that on while the camera didn't work. Okay. Anyway, I was talking about his difficult childhood. So chapter 2 then it details his parents' divorce and depression, both psychologically because of the difficulties he was having with his family and the fact that they were moving around. They were incredibly poor. His father had been a bootmaker, and then when they came to the United States, he could no longer practice that profession. He worked as a janitor. They were incredibly poor. So depression also because it was the time of the Great Depression, and they had a very difficult time just surviving. But deliverance comes in the fact that he never gives up. That's his famous motto now: never give up, never give up. And he somehow fights through all of his problems. And it's recognized that he's a gifted student. He's not able to actually get into school at first because he doesn't speak any English. He only speaks Yiddish and Hungarian. And then he finally gets into school, and he proves to be a great student. And he ends up going to, he gets plucked out of kind of obscurity and put into this private school called Townsend Prep for gifted kids. And with that comes a scholarship to attend City College in New York. And so that really becomes his ticket out of, Hell's Kitchen and all these bad things that he was living through. And he majors in criminology, sociology, criminology is his expertise within that. And that comes, he has a desire to fight crime based on his time in Hell's Kitchen. And so the time in Hell's Kitchen was very formative for him. And Romance and Revolutionaries, the third chapter, is about him meeting who would go on to become his wife, his childhood sweetheart, Gertrude Fried. And that obviously helped him in his personal life as well. And then Revolutionaries is about the time in City College, New York, where there was all this kind of revolutionary ferment leading up to, this is in the end of the 1930s, obviously leading up to World War II. And CCNY was a very kind of a radical school. It was kind of the Harvard of public schools at that time, and very prestigious. And he was there on a full scholarship. From there, again, this kid who came from nowhere, dirt poor, living in Hell's Kitchen, he only applies to one law school. Now, for those of you at the law school at Hong Kong U, you can appreciate that sometimes it's not hard to get into law school. Sometimes it's very hard to get into law school. It's not easy. He only applied to one law school, Harvard Law School, and he got in. Remarkable. He had no backup schools or anything. So that leads us to our next part of his life, kind of the next part of my book, which I call Preparing. The next chapter is Harvard and the World War II waiting game. And why do I call it the World War II waiting game? Well, because he is trying to get into the military, right? So he starts law school right as World War II is beginning. This is in 1940, right? World War II starts in September of 1939. And in 1940, World War II is raging. And then, of course, in 1941, Pearl Harbor, the end of 1941. He, like everybody else, wants to enlist in the military. And they won't let him in. They say he's too short. He's not really capable of being in the various service branches. There's a funny passage in the book where he really wants to become a pilot, but he jokes and says they wouldn't let him in because his feet couldn't reach the pedals to operate the aircraft. And interestingly, what happened is he was able to go all the way through law school without being drafted. And it turns out the reason why is because there was somebody at his local draft board in New York City who had himself been in law school at the time of World War I. That person was at Yale Law School and ended up going into the service, was drafted while at Yale Law School, and then got injured and was never able to complete his degree. And so this guy was sort of Ben Ferencz's guardian angel. He kept his file, and he never allowed for Ben to get drafted. So Ben was able to finish law school. And then he came back to New York City, went to his draft board and said, I've graduated from law school. I want to get into the military. Please let me in. And this person who had been protecting him told him this story. And he never saw the guy again, but this guy turned out to be had a tremendous impact on his life. And because of this, he had his law degree. And the fact that he had his law degree and went into the military made all the difference in the world, as I'll talk about in a moment. The next couple chapters, Private Benjamin and Patent Soldier, I will give you a little more detail on, because I want you to understand his World War II experience, because I think it's central to who he is as a person, what his life is about, what matters to him. But let me give you a little bit of background on World War II, because again, I think it's important to know about it to understand Ben Ferencz and his life. It's so central. So, of course, as I mentioned, the war begins in September 39 with the Nazi invasion of Poland. The Nazis, through 1940, conquer much of Europe. Ben sees this as he's going through law school, his early phase. In June 1941, the Nazis invade the USSR, Operation Barbarossa. And then, of course, we know that the war starts to turn against the Germans. The Nazis surrender at Stalingrad in January of 1943, kind of marked the, if you will, final turning point And then every bit of bad news coming into Germany signaled that the Nazis were going to lose as the Soviets swept west, and then D-Day in June of 1944, and the Allies are sweeping east, and they finally meet in Germany, and the Nazis surrender in May 1945, a complete and unconditional surrender. Now, as we look at this timeline, in 1940, Ben is at Harvard Law School. He gets a scholarship that allows him to study or become a research assistant with one of his professors. He ends up taking on a research assistant job with a professor by the name of Sheldon Gluck. Gluck is a criminal law professor at Harvard Law School. He's just been asked to assist regarding war crimes. He's helping the Pentagon as an advisor, and he decides that he's going to write a book on war crimes. And he has Ben Ferencz help him with this. Again, this is a very pivotal moment in Ben Ferencz's life. He spends the next year scouring the Harvard Law Library. He learns everything you can know about war crimes. And even though there wasn't much to talk about at that point in terms of war crimes prosecution, there had been contemplated prosecution of war crimes after World War I. Those ended up in some very, very pathetic low-level prosecutions in Leipzig, Germany. They were slaps on the hand. They were ineffectual. But Ben learned about all this. He had a very good knowledge of everything that led up to World War II. And then Gluck was getting reports of what was happening in Europe. In other words, Nazi war crimes. And so Ben was aware of that. I'm going to talk about that right now. Let me do that through the prism of his own training. Now, I'm a little surprised here. I thought I had some stuff here. Here we go. This is what I wanted to talk to you about, which was the Nazi war crimes that he was learning about. These slides are a little out of order. This is as he was working with Professor Gluck. The Nazis are murdering innocent civilians. They're destroying cities. They're shooting POWs. And then, of course, the Holocaust is going on. And Ben has some idea as to the occurrence of the Holocaust while he's working with Professor Gluck. And of course, these stages of the Holocaust, ghettoization, being forced into cattle cars, slave labor until death, mass shootings, and of course, extermination in the gas chambers. These are things that are starting to become apparent. And Ben is of the mindset and has the knowledge base when he goes into the Army to deal with this, and he later will. Now, let me go back to his experience in the Army. So basic training for him is he's graduated, right? This is the beginning of 1943. He goes through Camp Davis, Camp Pickett, Camp Bradford, Shanks. He finishes up at Fort Dix, and from there, they ship out to the UK. He's in an artillery battalion, an anti-aircraft artillery battalion, the 115th AAA. And the 115th AAA does its mobile training war maneuvers in England from December 43 through June 44. They go through Manchester, Freckleton, Salisbury, and then finally there's a very powerful scene where they're at Land's End. His unit is at Land's End in England, and he watches the Great Armada go off to land at the beaches of Normandy. This is D-Day. He's not with them. He was originally supposed to be, but the 115th, his part of it anyway, was kept back. He doesn't go out until July. He still crosses the English Channel. He still ends up on Omaha Beach. He sees all the carnage and wreckage. And then the 115th AAA is assigned to Patton's Army, the Third Army. And this is, one of the great campaigns in military history. Patton goes across France, and they really capture and destroy the German army as they go across. The German army has to retreat to the fatherland, and all these things are covered in Chapter 5. So his time in basic training. I call this chapter Private Benjamin. And then Patent Soldier is chapter 6. And there's a great passage. He becomes such an anti-war activist. But it's interesting, while he was with Patton and while they were going across France and defeating the Germans, he talks about how he felt this incredible desire to beat the Germans. And he spoke in a way that was somewhat similar to Patton. It's a great passage in the book. But what ends up happening is they get toward the German border and they kind of bog down. But by this point, the Allies have air superiority. Now, Ben is in an artillery battalion and he is a supply clerk. So that's another thing that should be pointed out. He becomes kind of a logistics genius. But the problem is, because the battalion is not that busy, again, the Allies have air superiority, and this is an anti-aircraft artillery battalion, he's not really doing much. So he applies for transfer, and he gets his dream job. He gets transferred to the judge advocate section of the Third Army. And so from December 44 until December 45, that's where he is. And he begins doing court-martial work, and then he ends up a war crimes investigator. So I'm going to talk about that now a little bit, because that's, again, this is a really pivotal part of his life. So this is the probing section. As I say, war crimes investigator, and I want to talk about that for a little bit. Now, one of the key things for him as he's becoming a war crimes investigator is Hitler's 1942 commando order and directives from Nazi leaders that crystallized into an overall normative injunction for the liquidation of all grounded Allied POWs. So what was happening is you would have Allied flyers who would, their planes would get shot down, but they would survive. They would come down in parachutes, and they were being beaten, tortured, lynched by Germans in wherever they would land. And so during the spring of 1945, Ferencz goes from working on courts-martial to helping establish a war crimes investigative unit and conducting investigations with respect to these so-called flyer murder cases. So he's really an innovator at this point. This is really the beginning, the birth of war crimes investigation in the sense that we know it today, as sort of a professional way of looking at evidence connecting defendants to war crimes. And the evidence that he was able to put together was key to convicting German war criminals before US military tribunals and at the Dachau trials. We'll talk about those in a moment. But what happens in early April 45, so he's only doing the flyer murder cases for a month and a half. And then in early 45, the Third Army's soldiers came across the gate of a camp surrounded by a high barbed wire fence. It had a wooden sign that read Arbeit macht frei, German meaning work will set you free, essentially, which is the infamous slogan that was seen at the entrance to Nazi concentration camps. And they found a hellish landscape, a pile of corpses, many in striped uniforms, stacked like lumber, and what looked like walking corpses. These were prisoners on the verge of death who were starving, and then a death pit where the Nazis had been dumping corpses for incineration. This was the concentration camp known as Ohrdruf. Ben was called in, and he began gathering evidence and witness statements. And this is the beginning of what I describe as a hellish spring of liberating and investigating Nazi concentration camps, including Buchenwald, Flossenburg, Mauthausen, and Ebensee. And this lasts through the summer of 1945. Now, he became a true expert in collecting evidence of war crimes at these concentration camps. He got it down to a system where he would stop, he would immediately go to what was known as the Schreibstube, which is the office where they kept the records for the camp. He would look in the Totenbücher, the death book, and then these were the death registries. and he learned how to figure out who was being murdered, how, under what circumstances. But it really took a big toll on it. And he's been psychically scarred ever since. Tremendous emotional impact on him. And really, as I say, if you talk about this stuff with him now, he will break down into tears, and he has trouble, honestly, reliving it or talking about it. But he did amazing work. Now, sort of having gone through all that, at the end of the summer, he gets assigned to a not as horrible job, if you will. He was investigating looting of largely Jewish artwork by Nazis. And this is a really interesting part of the book. He collaborates with the famous Monuments Men, about whom they made a movie with George Clooney not too long ago. He interrogates important witnesses such as Gisela Limburger, Hermann Goering's personal secretary. And this work contributes toward the prosecution of a portion of the case against Goering at the International Military Tribunal trial. That's the first big Nuremberg trial, and I'll talk about that in a second. In the meantime, the Dachau trials, which were held by the US Army at the Dachau concentration camp, these resulted in the conviction of over 1,500 Nazi war criminals related to the administration of various concentration camps, including Dachau, Buchenwald, Flossenburg. And the cases were supported in significant part by evidence collected by Ben Ferencz. And Ben Ferencz actually testified at the Flossenburg trial. And he was on the stand for quite some time. So he made an important contribution to this aspect of Holocaust justice. Now, I said I would talk about the International Military Tribunal because that is going on starting in November of 1945, around the same time that the Dachau trials are starting, a little bit after. These are the victorious allies, the US, the UK, France, and the USSR, entering into a treaty and creating the International Military Tribunal. This is the first trial at Nuremberg. So at the so-called Nuremberg trials consist of this trial and then the 12 subsequent trials, which is what Ben Ferencz was part of, and that I'll talk about at greater length. But right now, just realize that this was the first trial of the major Nazi war criminals. You can see the names of the judges who would sit on the bench and decide the fate of these Nazi war criminals. Convictions and sentences were imposed by an affirmative vote of at least 3 judges. And they were working from a charter that essentially, as you can see from this slide, the Constitution of the International Military Tribunal, Articles 1 to 4 set up the tribunal. Article 6 laid out its subject matter jurisdiction. And I mention all this because these are crimes that I will come back to when I talk about what's going on in Ukraine right now. But war crimes, crimes against peace, and crimes against humanity. War crimes are violations of the Geneva and Hague Conventions. The Geneva Conventions having to do with the way people are treated, people who are hors de combat, people who are protected. So primarily POWs, civilians, and wounded soldiers. They're to be treated with obviously a degree of care. Their rights are to be protected. And if things like willful killing, torture, medical experiments are committed on them, then those are war crimes. Hague law has to do with the method and means of warfare. So if there are, bombardments of civilian areas, for example. Crimes against peace is what we would refer to today as aggression. This is the planning, preparation, initiation, and execution of aggressive war. And then crimes against humanity, for the International Military Tribunal, it had to be linked to either war crimes or crimes against peace. And these were bad acts against the civilian population. So things like murder and extermination, before or during war, and persecution of protected groups. This was all part of crimes against humanity. There was also a conspiracy portion of Article 6, and then as well, members of certain organizations. So organizations themselves were prosecuted before this tribunal. So organizations like the SS, the Gestapo, and they were ultimately convicted. Now, we can see that we mostly focus on the individuals who were prosecuted. We have there were 22 total. We have top political leaders like Goering, Hess, military leaders like Keitel, Raeder, national ministers, von Ribbentrop, Frick, territorial governors, Frank, Seyss-Inquart, slave labor officials, Speer, Sauckel, police, Kaltenbrunner, propagandists, Streicher, Fritzsche. Now, some of these people were acquitted. Fritzsche, for example, who was head of the radio division, was acquitted, but Streicher, who was in charge of the famous newspaper Der Stürmer, a very rabidly anti-Semitic rag, he was convicted. Kaltenbrunner, who was in charge of the police apparatus, he was convicted and sentenced to death. I should note that Streicher was sentenced to death. Sauckel, who ran the slave labor program, was convicted and sentenced to death. Speer was spared. Speer was Hitler's architect, and he was also part of the program, but he gave an eloquent defense, and he was convicted, but he only served a prison term. Frank, who was head of the general government in Poland, Hans Frank, Seyss-Inquart, who was in charge in Holland, they were found guilty and executed, as was von Ribbentrop, who was the foreign secretary, and Frick, who was responsible for the infamous Nuremberg laws. He was the Ministry of Internal Ministry. Military leaders like Keitel and Jodl, they were also found guilty and executed. Raeder was given a prison sentence. Goering, who was at the very top, the lead defendant, and Hess. Goering was found guilty. He was Hitler's #2 man, and he was executed. Hess was found guilty, and he served a life sentence until he committed suicide in Spandau prison in 1985. So that was the International Military Tribunal. Now, let's get to where Ben Ferencz fits into this. He was as I said, investigator, and he was discharged from the army in December of 1945. I'll talk about that in a moment. And so we're going to look at his discharge and then his meetings at the Pentagon, which leads to him going to Nuremberg. Then his taking over of the Berlin branch, which was the chief investigative office for the Nuremberg prosecutions. And then the Einsatzgruppen trial, which Professor Vogt mentioned, and then his becoming executive counsel of the prosecution office. So let's begin with chapter 10. This is from his time of discharge into going back to Nuremberg. So he's discharged, he's awarded 5 battle stars, but at the beginning of 1946, he was recruited by the army to return to the Dachau trials and by an at-large US federal government initiative to try the leading Nazi war criminals after the IMT trial. These would be the so-called Nuremberg subsequent proceedings, which I'll tell you a little bit more in my next slide. Ferencz opted to sign up for the latter. So he took the Nuremberg job, and I think it's understandable. There were higher level defendants. And then he quickly married his childhood sweetheart, Gertrude Fried, and then he ships out to Nuremberg. He began as an investigator for the industrialist cases. These were against German industrialists who helped Hitler arm and carry out aggressive war and use slave labor. People like Frick, Krupp, and I.G. Farben. Ferencz was doing a great job, and he was showing leadership qualities. So the head of the office in the fall of 1946, Telford Taylor, puts him in charge of the operation's main investigative unit, the Berlin branch, which is where evidence for most of the subsequent proceedings, trials, was being collected. So this was a huge job. And keep in mind, this is 1946. This guy is only 26 years old. So he's a kid still in many respects. And he's got this amazing position that he's been put into. So what he's doing is he's providing the evidence for these subsequent trials before what are known as the Nuremberg Military Tribunals, the NMTs. The first trial was before the International Military Tribunal. These are before the US Nuremberg Military Tribunals. They go from 1946 to 1949. And it's a series of 12. I'll talk about the trials a little bit more in a moment, but it's the next layer of leadership in terms of military, political, and economic for Nazi Germany. It's run pursuant to what's known as Control Council Law number 10, which was issued in December of 1945. And it allowed each of the occupying powers, the Soviets, the French, the British, and the Americans, to hold trials of war criminals in their respective zones. It was almost identical to the IMT Charter, but importantly, in terms of crimes against humanity, it did not require a nexus with crimes against peace or war crimes. So this is a huge development in terms of crimes against humanity becoming more important in these prosecutions. Now, the judges in all these trials were American. They tended to be from American state courts, most of them state supreme courts. The trials took place in the same, most of them in the same courtroom as the first trial, the famous Nuremberg courtroom 600. And the chief counsel was Brigadier General Telford Taylor, who hired Ben Ferencz. And then, of course, in other occupation zones, similar trials took place. But the most important of these zonal trials were the American subsequent 12 trials that Ben Ferencz worked on. Let me just tell you briefly about these trials again, so you can put them into perspective. The first was the doctor's trial. These defendants conducted human experimentation. This is where, of course, Mengele, if he had been caught, he would have been in the dock, the famous Josef Mengele from Auschwitz. The milk trial, this was a Luftwaffe field marshal accused of human experimentation and mistreatment of POWs and civilian slave laborers. The judges' trial, these were officials of the Reich Ministry of Justice or prosecutors or judges of Nazi courts. This was made into the famous movie Judgment at Nuremberg with Spencer Tracy and Marlene Dietrich. Interesting side note, Ben Ferencz met Marlene Dietrich and got to know her while she was a performer for the Third Army when he was in the Third Army. That's in my book. I encourage you to read chapter 7 to know more about that. The Pole trial, where the defendants worked in the economic administrative SS office charged with running the concentration and extermination camps. The Flick trial, where the defendants produced armaments during the war, engaged in slave labor and plundering. The IG Farben trial, the defendants were executives of the infamous chemical conglomerate that produced Zyklon B, the gas that was used in the gas chamber, the chemical that was used in the gas chambers during the Holocaust. The hostages trial, the defendants there engaged in reprisals against civilians in the Southeast Europe, including the Balkans, and scorched earth policy in Norway. The Russia trial, this is the Race and Resettlement Office. These defendants were from that office and they were part of the Nazi racial crimes. And of course, the Einsatzgruppen trial, which I'll talk to you about in greater depth in a moment. These were defendants from SS mobile death squads that operated behind the front lines in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe. They would follow the Wehrmacht in, and they were the opening phase of the Holocaust. They would murder innocent civilians, primarily Jews, as they followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union. The Krupp trial, Krupp produced armaments and used slave labor. Ministries, these were officials of various Reich ministries. And then the High Command trial, the defendants were high-ranking Nazi military officials, generals, and an admiral. These resulted in about 142 convictions based on 185 defendants. So there was a lot of success, a lot of interesting law was made, and Ben Ferencz became the executive counsel of this whole operation. But let me begin with how he became a prosecutor in the first place. And that really begins at the Berlin branch. So all these trials that we just looked at, he's the one who's in charge of collecting the evidence for these. So from August 46 through May 47, he heads this big investigative unit. There were over 50 people working for him, and it's collecting evidence for these trials. They're scouring all the buildings and ruins of Berlin for any documents, incriminating documents. And in a foreign ministry annex located near the Tempelhof airport, investigator Fred Buren stumbled across an enormous cache of documents that had been slated for pulping, but somehow got overlooked. These were Einsatzgruppen daily reports from the Soviet Union, styled Ereignismeldungen aus der UdSSR. So these were daily reports from the USSR, chronicling in minute detail all of the activities of these mobile murder units. So my next slide is powerful. Ben Ferencz gets this, right? And this is a passage from my book. Armed with a little adding machine, he pored over the reports and started totaling the numbers. Once the figure exceeded 1 million murdered, he put the calculator away and decided to hop on the next Douglas C-47 twin-engine plane from Tempelhof to Nuremberg to report these findings to Telford Taylor. Then the next passage, and this is a quote from him. I went to Telford and I said, he told me this when I was interviewing him. I have this on tape. I went to Telford and I said, we have to put on a new trial. He said, we can't. I said, look, I've got this evidence here. It's all together here in a big binder, 1 million murders. He said, we can't put on a new trial now, Ben. We've already got all the lawyers assigned. The Pentagon is not going to approve of a new thing. As it is, they're not very happy with this dragging out. So I blew my cool. I said, you can't let these guys go. This is mass murder on a scale never before seen in human history. You're going to say, no, you can't put on a new trial? He said, well, can you do it in addition to your other work? I said, sure. So he said, okay, you go do it. So that is how he became the chief prosecutor of the Einsatzgruppen trial. It hadn't been planned, but he had found the evidence, and he then transferred from Berlin to Nuremberg. And in September of 1947, September 29th to be exact, the Einsatzgruppen trial began. Now, what I'd like to do is just kind of give you a sense of the defendants in this trial. I'll tell you a little bit about it. But there were 4 Einsatzgruppen, A, B, C, and D. And what Ferencz was able to do, because he could not get additional prosecutors hired. So what Taylor said was, look, I'm going to make you chief prosecutor, and then you try to find prosecutors on other teams and see if you could essentially poach them. So one of the lawyers he poached was a guy named John Glancy, and he put him in charge of prosecuting and preparing for the defendants of Einsatzgruppe A. And you can see, this is a fascinating chart, but it has the defendants' names and their ranks. And really interesting, because Ferencz is often asked, how did you choose the defendants? So he laughs a little bit and says, well, part of it was just a matter of the furniture. And you say, well, what do you mean? Well, there were only 24 seats in the dock. So that meant that at a maximum, they could only have 24 defendants. And then he said what he really wanted to do was get those who were most responsible. So Yost was a civil servant, but he had degrees in law and economics. Sandberger studied jurisprudence. He was an assistant judge. Edward Strauch was a graduate of Erlangen University. Ferencz himself handled Einsatzgruppe B. And we see Erich Naumann, who was a commercial firm employee and a police officer. Franz Six, who was a university professor. Walter Blume, who was a university graduate and police inspector. Eugen Steimle, who studied various languages and became a school teacher. Adolf Ott was an administrator in the German Workers' Front. Interesting, Voldemar Klingelhofer was an opera singer and voice teacher. He's one of the more fascinating ones, and the information in the book on him is very interesting. We can see that Arnold Horvath was the prosecutor for C. These folks operated in the Ukraine area. So B was around Moscow, A was in the Baltics, C was in the Ukraine area, and they were all attached to these different army groups. But again, we see Roche, Doctor of Law and Economics, Paul Blobel, who was an architect, and he was in charge of the horrific Babi Yar massacre. one of the worst massacres in all of the Holocaust. Von Radetzky was a former linguist. Hensch studied law. Fendler was a doctor in dentistry. Schultz was a lawyer, and Bieberstein was a clergyman. And then we have Einsatzgruppen D, and they were down at the lower end in the Crimea and the Caucasus. Otto Ohlendorf was the lead defender and the most famous. He had testified at the IMT trial that his unit murdered 100,000 or 90,000 innocent civilians. He had the second highest IQ of all the Nuremberg defendants. You can see his university degrees. All these guys, Seiber, Graf, Schubert, Ruhl, Braune, Noski, they're all in banking, law, commercial enterprises. It's remarkable to see how sophisticated these guys were, school teachers, and they were bloody murders. They killed over 1 million people, their groups did. Almost all of them, they were all found guilty. Most of them were sentenced to death. I'm going to talk about what happened to the sentences of these guys in a moment. But before I leave the Einsatzgruppen trial, I just wanted to briefly discuss the bench. The chief judge who you see here is Robert Musmano. The other two judges were not very remarkable. They were from the US South. But Musmano was a remarkable character. I write about him in depth in my book. He did everything from, meet Mussolini and hang out with him in Italy. He wrote many books. One of his books was made into a movie called Black Fury in 1935, starring Paul Muni. He represented Sacco and Vanzetti in the famous Sacco and Vanzetti trial. An incredibly colorful character. He was the chief judge, and he was really along with Ferencz, I would say the outstanding personality, and Ohlendorf in the trial. So very interesting. He was against the death penalty because of his feelings about the Sacco and Vanzetti case. And when it came time to come up with a sentence against the Einsatzgruppen defendants, he went to a monastery and prayed. He was a devout Catholic, and he realized that the evidence was so crystal clear that he could vote for the death penalty. And therefore, many of these men were sentenced to death. Now, the final part of my talk before I get into your questions, I want to talk about Ferencz's work as a Holocaust reparations lawyer and his work as reparations and representing Jewish victims. But before I do that, let me just go back to this section on prosecution. So I want to just finish with executive counsel, which is the last part of this. So he does so well in the Einsatzgruppen trial. The most death sentences handed out in any trial at Nuremberg was the Einsatzgruppen trial. It was done quite well. The case was tried by the prosecution quite well. Telford Taylor was very pleased with Ben Ferencz. And so he makes him executive counsel, basically the number 2 person under Telford Taylor in the prosecution office. So Ben is in charge of now pretty much the whole office. And one of the things that I talk about toward the end of this chapter is that there's a movement in Germany to have many of these defendants' sentences, in other words, the ones from the subsequent proceedings, commuted. And a guy named John J. McCloy becomes the governor of occupied Germany. He is an old line attorney from the United States. He had been the assistant secretary or secretary of war in the War Department during the war. And ironically, he was one of the people most responsible for setting up the architecture of the Nuremberg trials. But he was unfortunately weak and a bit too indecisive in terms of all these appeals that Germans be given less harsh sentences. And he ended up commuting a lot of the sentences. Only 5 defendants, I believe, in the end were executed, including 4 Einsatzgruppen, including Ohlendorf. And I point out in my book that Ben Ferencz was responsible in many respects for convincing McCloy to uphold the death sentences for them. Pohl, who was in charge of running all those concentration camps, was also executed. But many were released. And this was based on Cold War concerns. The US was now hoping to curry favor with Germany, and West Germany is being created. And so McCloy weakens, and honestly, by the end of the 1950s, all of these guys, except for the ones who were executed, were let out of jail. And it's really a travesty. But Ben is there, he's there for that and winding down the trials. And then we move into where he gets recruited, and it's the next phase, which is my next section of my book, which is providing. And chapter 15 is about his work for restitution as the head of what's known as the Jewish Restitution Successor Organization, the JRSO. And he is able to get all this property that the Nazis stole from the Jews and return it and use it to help Jewish survivors. It's a remarkable part of the story, and he's really a pioneer in this area. Chapter 16, Moral Indemnity, is about reparations. And he's a big part of the negotiations between Germany, West Germany at this point, and Konrad Adenauer, and Israel, as well as the leading Jewish organizations, for a reparations treaty, which is known as the Luxembourg Treaty of 1941, which helps Jewish survivors. Germany makes an enormous amount of money available, and Ferencz runs this program. So the Jewish survivors are able to get their whatever settlement they're entitled to based on their sufferings during the war. And then the final part of this section, finishing the reparations revolution, this is chapter 17, where he comes back to the United States. He joins with Telford Taylor in a law firm, and he continues to do work on behalf of victims of the Holocaust. And he has all kinds of success. I detail that. But he's really probably the one person in all of Holocaust justice who represents, in one person, Holocaust investigation, Holocaust prosecution, and Holocaust reparations. He did it all. So he is an incredible figure in terms of Holocaust justice. And then the final part of the book is preventing. And this is where I talk about his efforts to criminalize aggression, to create the International Criminal Court. So the new Lemkin is related to Raphael Lemkin, who was the one who pushed for the Genocide Convention in 1948. And of course, now when we talk about prosecuting genocide, that was because of Lemkin, who was a Holocaust survivor who coined the term genocide, genos from people in Greek, side from killing in Latin. And the new Lemkin is Ferencz's new Lemkin at Nuremberg. And he sort of took on the crusade to criminalize aggression the way Lemkin did genocide earlier. And then creating a permanent court in the Eternal City is about the creation of the International Criminal Court, for which Ben Ferencz was so instrumental. He was a voice in the wilderness ever since the end of the Nuremberg trials, calling for a permanent International Criminal Court. That took place in 1998 in Rome, where the so-called Rome Statute was adopted, the treaty that created the International Criminal Court. Ferencz was there, and he was an important player in that, and I detail that in the book. And then finally, the time machine, where the final chapter where he goes back into the courtroom at the International Criminal Court for the first trial, and he helps give the closing argument. So it takes him from the opening, one of the opening arguments in Nuremberg, to the closing argument in the first trial of the International Criminal Court, and that's why I call it the time machine. A fascinating life and fascinating contributions. Now, let me just conclude with my reflections on Ukraine, and then I'll open it up for questions. Now, these crimes that I've talked about, war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, those are all now being investigated by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. And aggression is not possible because it was limited in the way that it was brought into the Rome Statute or the ICC treaty. So Ben Ferencz has recently called for the creation of a new Nuremberg style tribunal that can try Russia's crimes of aggression. And at the same time, he's been a voice. For example, he just did an interview with Christian Amanpour, showing how the Russians have been committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And now there are even allegations, and President Joe Biden has said they may be committing genocide. Now, genocide, we've looked at the definition of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Genocide is the destruction in whole or in part of a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such. And I don't think have evidence of that quite yet, of what's going on in Ukraine. But since the Russian invasion on February 24th of 2022, there's mounting evidence of atrocities, and investigators I have been encouraging through interviews I've been doing in the media need to collect and be aware of the evidence that could eventually prove a genocide case, because it would seem that the Russians have talked about eliminating Ukraine as a separate nationality. And there are certainly signs that could lead us to believing that a genocide prosecution is possible. But I'll conclude there. I'll open it up for questions. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Gregory. That's wonderful. Before, I just want to remind our audience that you can use the Q&A function and also the chat, or just raise your hand. But I just want to ask you, because I know that you've told in our previous discussions about this. I hear you're sometimes still in touch with Ben Ferencz. I mean, how is he doing? How is he?
I just talked to him last week. I just called him. You know, I'm lucky. I have kind of a privileged access to him. I can just call him. This is funny. I said, you know, Ben, I'm now starting to wrap up my first draft of the manuscript, and something occurred to me. I don't know what the color tie was you were wearing when you opened the Einsatzgruppen trial. It's all the photos are in black and white. What color was your tie? And he told me it was burgundy. So I that's now going into the book, but I'm at that level of detail now. And whenever I have questions, I call him. It's remarkable. He is 102 years old, that his memory is so good that he can still remember that. We had a very nice chat. He's always ribbing me, saying, when are you going to get that book done? Get it done. He's got a, you know, he still has his raspy New York accent. He's still kind of a wisecracker. He's really quite a character. But yeah, we're lucky to still have him. And I do speak with him. He helps me put the finishing touches, or has been, on my book. I should note, by the way, I have spent days with him interviewing him. So I've spent, like I said, literally days. We tape recorded interviews. And then I've spent a lot of time with him on the phone since COVID, because of, you know, I haven't been able to travel to Florida, but we talked a lot on the phone. So, yeah.
That's great. Thanks.
Looks like we got a couple of hands up.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gordon, for this really rich and fascinating talk. And again, apologies to you, Professor Gordon, and also to all of you in the audience for the technical issues we had at the beginning. To echo what Roland was saying, you know, we have some time for Q&A. So if you have questions, please do type them into the chat box, and you can send the questions to us privately as well. I also had a question I wanted to ask, and my question, I mean, your talk was so rich, and I'm very interested in the process of writing it. So my question is about the genre of biography. Biography, as many people have said, is an art, and it's a difficult one. There are issues of, you know, questions of objectivity, how you keep a distance from your material, questions about the balance between writing about a particular person and writing about the issues of a period, questions about how you write about something as elusive as the zeitgeist of a period. So the legal issues, the evidence presented in the trial, but also how the trials were kind of thought about in a period. So I was wondering whether you could say a little bit about your thoughts on the art of biography and your thoughts on what it means to be writing about a life.
Yeah, those are great questions. First off, let me just say that although I was approached by the family and asked to write the biography, I made it very clear from the beginning that I don't intend this to be a kind of hagiography, that I want to find the truth about this man's life. But, you know, I also want to make sure that somehow I'm conveying to the world how important his legacy is, but yet at the same time that he's a human like the rest of us and that he has foibles. And I think that'll come out. I've spent 4 years, you know, really thinking about what does it mean and learning to be a biographer. You're right, it's a craft. And I love the genre myself. I don't know that I have a particular model, or I did when I started. I do love David McCullough quite a bit, and I love nonfiction generally. So I'm pretty, you know, I'd say that, you know, I'm pretty well schooled. You know, whether it's reading Doris Kearns Goodwin or as I say David McCullough, or you know even Philip Sands in my own field. Who wrote a really good book, a great book called East West Street, that dealt with Lemkin and Lauterpacht, or Hirsch Lauterpacht in my field. I've been trying to sort of take my notes and be attuned to how I can best present Ben Ferencz's life. I am, you know, a lawyer, and that's my training. And so I think there's certainly, when the title of the book is tentatively, you know, Nuremberg citizen prosecutor Benjamin Ferencz and the birth of international justice. So I'm trying to give the context. I'm trying to tell his life within the context of what was going on around him. So that's very important. There's a lot obviously in there about World War II, but equally, I have a lot on what was going on during the Cold War, and what was going on with the Vietnam War and how that affected him, and things related to that. For example, he represented Vietnam War protesters in court who were being prosecuted. And this was, you know, an incredible opportunity for him to seek justice in a different forum. So, you know, I'm trying to show how that all fits together, if you will. And it's a challenge. It's about a 200,000 word manuscript at this point. Law professors usually don't write anything that long. But I'd like to think that there are going to be some really incredible revelations that have come from my doing really, really in-depth archival research. I've spent days in the National Archives. I spent, you know, I've looked through the archives of Telford Taylor and Sheldon Gluck and other Nuremberg lawyers and, you know, Army records. And I mean, it's quite well detailed and archival. But yet I've tried to make it not for lawyers, but for lay audiences, and hopefully lawyers will appreciate it too. So that's kind of been my perspective.
Thank you. And apologies for those of you who had your hand up. Another way of asking a question is just to raise your hand. And so if you want to ask a question, that's possible too. In that way, that's possible too.
It looks like I've got a question. If you want me, Marco, just to go to it. It says,
had the hands up.
Oh, okay. So I'll do whatever you guys want. There's one here in the Q&A, and then if anybody has a hand up, I'll answer all of them.
Yeah, maybe we take the Clive Grossman, the hands up first, because I saw it came on a while ago.
Sounds good.
Mr. Grossman, you need to unmute.
Should I take the Q&A one while we're
why don't you take
okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, sounds good. So it says, thank you for an excellent talk. I appreciate that. You're welcome. My question is about the dilemma between military victory and therefore force and violence and justice. You mentioned that Ferencz became a pacifist and also that when serving under Patton, he was driven to defeat the Nazis. How did he square the problem that justice at Nuremberg was only possible because of the Allied victory? How does he and you square the current dilemma that justice in Ukraine may only be possible through the military defeat of Russia? That's a great question. Thank you. Let me answer that. It's from Andrew Park. Andrew, I think there is something that is ultimately a kind of a tension in Ferencz's life and work that is not resolved. So I think he knows, and he knew at the time, that military force was necessary to defeat the Nazis. And as you point out, without the military victory, then the Nazis could not have been put on trial. And yet, I think his idea is that right now we live in a world where that's necessary, but he wants to dream of a world where it's not. So I think he would reconcile it, and I do to a certain extent, by saying that the way things work in the current world, we have to sometimes use military force for justice. I think everybody would agree that what's going on in Ukraine right now, the Russian invasion, is illegal, and that it needs to be stopped. And the only way it can be stopped is through force. And I think he would recognize that Article 51 of the UN Charter allows for self-defense, for example. But I think he would like to think that we can move eventually into a world, maybe it's not possible, maybe it's utopian, but where armed force isn't needed because we've also been able to eliminate the kind of crimes that we've been talking about, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide. So I think Ferencz works on both levels. You know, he's trying to work on the level of stopping the atrocities that are the, if you will, the fruit of aggression. And at the same time, he wants to end what could ever lead to aggression, which means that armed force is never considered. So if we could do both, maybe that sounds like a utopian ideal. I'm not maybe as optimistic as he is, but I think we can certainly reduce and hopefully largely eliminate the need for military force, at the same time bring about justice. So thank you for the great question. Now, do we have any, there were some people who had their hands raised. Are we able to, I've got something in the chat. So one is, when will the book be published? And let me just say there, I am writing the epilogue as we speak. In fact, if I were not doing this right now, I'd be writing the epilogue. As soon as the epilogue is done, I'm going to hand it over to my publisher, which is University of Virginia Press. And then they're going to do their post-submission review. And then it needs to be copy edited, and there's still some time. But I say the sooner the better. And if I give you a little teaser, I will tell you that the epilogue opens with the invasion of Ukraine, appropriately, I think, enough. And I will also tell you, and I think it's powerful, that the entire book itself begins with the Babi Yar massacre. So the book begins and ends in Ukraine. So it's interesting. You're welcome, Andrew. Clive Grossman raised a hand. Clive, please feel free to unmute yourself, and I'm here for any questions. Are folks not able? Can you unmute Clive yourself? You guys are the host.
Oh, he is unmuted.
Yeah.
Mr. Grossman?
He said, not sure we can unmute. I think this is a technical difficulty that was related to the one that I experienced. Mr. Grossman, could you write out your question in the chat, and then I'm happy to answer it. And in the meantime, I have another one, which I'm happy to answer. This is from Tracy Chung. Do you think international law can deter effectively military criminals? I believe is the question. I believe that it can have a deterrent effect. Again, I don't believe in utopias. I think there will probably always be crime, just as if you were to ask me, do I think that criminal law can deter people from committing crimes? Yes, but not 100%. I think we need to have the laws. I think we need to have the, if you will, message from the law that we need to deter these crimes. But it won't always be successful. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have it. So now I'm just trying to see if Mr. Grossman has had a chance. Yeah, I'm not hearing him, and I don't see anything in the chat box.
Yeah, he appears as that he is unable to talk from our end, so I don't know why this is not working.
I have a question from Fred Birnbaum. Where can we purchase the book when it's released? So it is the trade side of UVA Press that is publishing it. So they're going to make it very much like a trade book. In other words, like a commercial book that you would be able to get. It should be at I hope and I think a reasonable price point. Although I have to say that I think we're going to have a discussion about how many words my manuscript is. We'll see how indulgent they'll be. But you should be able to get it definitely on Amazon or other places like that. If you, obviously I'm here in Hong Kong, and I would be happy to sign a copy, Mr. Birnbaum. Are you here in Hong Kong? If so, I'll do it. If you're here in Hong Kong, I'll be happy to sign it. So as soon as it comes out, please, you're at the UJC. Well, I am a member of the UJC, so we should be able to find each other. That's great. Yeah, absolutely. Say hi to Rabbi Z and Rabbi Martha for me. All right. There's another question. What are some of Benjamin's biggest regrets in his long legal career? What could he do better if given another chance to relive his life? You know, that's also a terrific question. I don't think that he has huge regrets. I think, you know, if he has any regrets, it's probably just how long it took for there to be a permanent international criminal court. For so long, he was a voice in the wilderness. And I think it was just very frustrating for him. I think one thing that's interesting to point out is that during the kind of the peak of the Cold War, and especially in the 1980s, there was kind of a waning interest. And Rabbi Martha's actually watching this. That's good to know. She's one of my favorite people in Hong Kong. She knows it. Thank you for being here, Rabbi Martha. I was just going to say that I think that Ferencz was largely forgotten as of the 1980s, and then in the 1990s, in the post-Cold War period, where there was a chance for him to kind of reemerge with the rebirth of international criminal law. He found his voice again. I don't know whether he's a loner in many respects. I think he would admit that. And I think maybe if he had been a little bit more, proactive in certain ways, in terms of making connections in his network, maybe he could have been a little more effective. He did a lot of writing during that period. He wrote a number of books. You can see in the slide that's still up. You see Defining International Aggression, The Search for World Peace. So he did a lot of that. That was a lot of his work. I think one thing that he definitely has expressed regret on is, you see how big those books are? You see the photos of the size of the books in the photo. He ended up later writing books that were much more accessible for the everyday person to read. So I think that would be something that if he had to do it all over again, he would have written books that were more accessible to the public. So great question, but I don't think he has a lot of regrets because he's done everything that he wanted to do with his life. I think if he could somehow be spared the psychic trauma that he experienced from the Holocaust and not go through the pain he goes through, I'm sure he would like to somehow have that, but then he wouldn't have gone in the direction he did with his career, and he's done exactly with his career what he's wanted to do. So All right, there's another question. After the Americans liberated Dachau, it was reported that they shot many of the guards and were also to be prosecuted for war crimes. The Russians too. Did anything happen? There was an investigation on that, and there were indeed shootings, and they were probably illegal, technically, but we're talking about SS guards who were committing unspeakable acts in running these concentration camps. And I think the truth is no one cared. I think it was found, there was an investigation, it was found that people took liberties that they shouldn't have, and nothing was done. Again, I think given the climate at the time, it's kind of understandable. Let me point out that Ben Ferencz himself, at Ebensee, which is one of the last concentration camps that he investigated, he saw prisoners grab an SS man and beat him to within an inch of his life, and then they put him in an oven, and then they would let him, you know, suffer in the oven, then take him out and put him back in. Ferencz watched this. I don't think it's anything that he's terribly proud of now, but you have to realize this is the end of his time of investigating all these concentration camps. And he was just, not only was he worn out psychologically, physically, he was traumatized. He definitely has PTSD. But he was numbed to it. And I think that was probably true for a lot of Allied investigators, MPs, people who are at these scenes and let these things happen. Like I said, I don't think it's something that he's proud about. I detail this in my book, obviously this incident, but it's something that happened, and you know, we're never going to probably see justice for something like that. But I'm glad that you brought it up, because these were horrible places. When you read chapter 8 of my book and you see what was happening at the concentration camps when he goes in for the liberation, I mean, I'll tell you this, I was depressed when I wrote that chapter. I found myself having trouble getting through the writing. I slept a lot, and I was just flat out depressed. So it took a toll on me to write that chapter. That's chapter 8 of the book. And I was just doing the research and, you know, recounting what happened. Imagine living through that. So, yeah.
Gregory, I have a question. You mentioned the legacy of Ben Ferencz, and
yeah,
you can see it sort of like in the way he's pioneered the collection of evidence for war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide, and also in the way he's like sort of pressed for compensation of victims and reparations, and also for the restitution of stolen assets. Where do you sort of see, or where does he see his biggest legacy, and where do you see it? Where did he live the biggest imprint?
He and I are in agreement on this. Actually, we've talked about it. He sees his biggest and his most important legacy as the work that he did on behalf of victims of the Holocaust. To him, that's the thing that matters the most to him. He's known for the Nuremberg prosecution work, but he personally cares more about the work that he did for Holocaust victims. And I personally think that that's his most important legacy. And I will be making that very clear in my book. You know, part of the reason that I wanted to write the book was to discuss this aspect of his career. And I wish I'd had more time. I realized that I could have gone into more details on his restitution and his reparations work. But, you know, he was a total pioneer. He was responsible for billions of dollars going to victims of the Holocaust, where it needed to go. And honestly, he's also because of the part that he played in the Luxembourg Treaty of 1951, which provided billions of dollars to Israel from West Germany. You know, that's responsible for Israel, you know, surviving and thriving as a nation. And I think that that's an equally important legacy, you know, apart from the individuals he's helped. I personally think helping the state of Israel is another thing that is very important. But one last final thing, let me just say though, while I think that that's the most important aspect, to me, as I said earlier, it's really crucial to understand that he represents Holocaust justice from beginning to end in a way that nobody else does. Investigation, prosecution, reparations. I mean, that's a remarkable legacy. And as I say, he's the connective tissue between retribution and restitution, which is incredibly significant to me.
I'm conscious of the time, so I think we can take one more question, if you're happy with that, Greg.
Oh yeah, I'm sympathetic to the fact that we got a late start because of the tech issues. So I'm happy to stay a little later if it doesn't bother anybody else.
We have a new question in the chat.
Okay, I'm going to go to it. So let's see. This says, I'm just trying to get up to the top here. To what objective degree must a general atrocity reach in order for an international military tribunal to be considered and established? On the same issue, is the decision to conduct such a tribunal to any extent subjective in the sense that it is conduct based on the interests of countries, much like Russia's right to veto in the Security Council? If so, may international justice be effectively achieved? So there are a few questions there. I think the first is in terms of the objective evaluation of evidence. I don't know that there's a mathematical formula, but I think that we have seen a tremendous amount of evidence, a lot of it through social media, which is a new phenomenon in what's happening in Ukraine, that allows us to conclude that atrocities are being committed, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and certainly aggression's been committed. Aggression, the only problem is jurisdictional. That is easily prosecutable here. And I think when you look at other situations where there have been decisions to create tribunals, if you look at Nuremberg and you look at the International Military Tribunal and the Nuremberg Military Tribunals, there was a tremendous amount of evidence that there was a commission that was set up during the war under the auspices of the UN to evaluate and collect and preserve war crimes evidence. So usually when these things are set up, there's a reasonable basis. Now, there is realpolitik. And for example, like you talked about Russia and its veto power, that's what's preventing right now the Security Council from referring a case of aggression to the International Criminal Court, is that a Security Council referral requires that there be no veto by one of the permanent members. Russia's a permanent member, it can veto. And so that is a problem. Now, there's another question. How far do you think he would be satisfied with the limitations that are ultimately present in the Rome Statute? I'm assuming you mean Ben Ferencz. He is not happy at all with the aggression provision. So what happened is, thanks to his, in large part to his great efforts in Rome in 1998, aggression, which the United States did not want in the statute, was put in the statute. And then it was agreed that it would be defined and that its operationalization or the effective jurisdiction of it would be determined later. That happened at a conference in Kampala in 2010. I had the good privilege of attending that conference, where there was a negotiation that resulted in what are known as the Kampala Amendments, which defined aggression and which allowed for the exercise of jurisdiction. The way that jurisdiction regime is set up right now does not allow for prosecution of Russia. Ben Ferencz was against that. He was at Kampala too. I got to spend a little time with him in Kampala. That's where I really first started to get to know him. And he's against that. And he's right to be against it. I am now on the board of advisors for the Global Initiative for the Prevention of Aggression. And we are moving toward trying to persuade countries, in light of what's happened in Ukraine, to change the way that jurisdiction is exercised with respect to aggression. And I'm hoping that we'll now have some momentum based on what's happening in Ukraine right now. But yes, he is very disappointed in the way that aggression has been criminalized in the Rome Statute.
So Professor Gordon has indicated that he's happy to stay on for a little bit longer. Are there any other questions?
Maybe I might try one last one now that we have your expertise still here. So if you've prosecuted war crimes yourself, what needs to be done in order to make sure that these prosecutions actually function? I mean, like, what kind of evidence, what needs to be done? For instance, if we look at a place like now in Ukraine, what is really important to get it right at this moment in order to have a prosecution further down the line succeed?
Yeah, it's really, in many respects, nuts and bolts logistics. So you've got to get investigators into those. It's a matter of crime scenes. You've got to go to the crime scene. Take Bucha, for example, where outside of Kiev, where we know that there were massacres, atrocities. You've got to get people to go down there. They have to do the forensic investigation. There are mass graves. They need to dig up the bodies. They need to do ballistics analysis. They need to do autopsies. They need to talk to witnesses. They have to look at other evidence, like social media evidence, that will help corroborate what happened. And then, so that's the first part. And then the next part, and of course, these are all kind of linked, but then you have to tie those specific things to specific people. And really, ideally, you're going to go up the chain as high as you can. And, you know, it gets harder as you go higher up the chain. But we do have a concept called command responsibility. And if you can prove that a commander was in a superior subordinate relation with people who committed these crimes and knew or should have known about it and didn't take preventive action or didn't punish these people, then that can create liability. The question is, how far up the chain can you go with that? And as I say, the higher you go up, the harder it gets. And then when you start looking at going into Moscow, that becomes increasingly, you know, a challenge. That's the advantage of an aggression prosecution. And I do hope that this idea might be viable, that Ben Ferencz and others, such as Philip Sands, who I mentioned earlier, have put forward, Dapo Akande, various others, which is the creation of an ad hoc tribunal, because we can't do it through the International Criminal Court because of the aggression regime that I mentioned. But if you're only looking at crimes against humanity and war crimes and possibly genocide, it does get harder as you go higher up the chain. So I think those are the real challenges that we face.
We have one more question in the chat. The question is, the United States and the ICC have a strange relationship. Did Ferencz have anything to say to that?
Yeah, I mean, so chapter 19 of the book is about the creation of the International Criminal Court. I think you'll enjoy that because that chapter, you know, talks about all these strange, if you will, relationships or, you know, dynamics that exist between the U.S. and the court. There's a great scene where Ferencz and former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense for John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, where he calls Ferencz out of the blue and says, let's do an op-ed in the New York Times. They do an op-ed in the New York Times. Bill Clinton reads it and says, okay, you know what? We need to sign this treaty. And it's the last day that it can be signed. Dave Sheffer, my former boss, when I was doing this work, who was the ambassador at large for war crimes at that point, this was New Year's Day, 2001, I think. He trudges up, he takes a train from DC to New York, and in the snow, because I think it's New Year's Day and there are no cabs and there's been a giant snowstorm, he goes to UN headquarters and he's just covered with snow and he signs the Rome Statute. And then, as we know, unfortunately, George W. Bush then got elected and unsigned the statute. So technically we've signed it and we had a tremendous role in negotiating it. And I do believe that we need to reestablish our relationship. I believe that unless the United States becomes actively involved and takes a leadership role with the court, international justice is going to be elusive. So let's hope that that relationship gets worked out. Joe Biden has a much better attitude, by the way, as did Barack Obama, about the court.
Great. I think, again, I'm conscious of the time, so I think we'll have to bring it to a close here.
Sure.
So thank you again, Professor Gordon, for this really rich and fascinating talk. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Have a lovely evening, and we hope to see you again soon at one of these events.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.